London always woke the same way, wrapped in a fog that was neither water nor air. It was the kind of light that forgave nothing, where gray swallowed every color, and even the trees seemed like lawyers, upright, solemn, and quietly judgmental. In a red brick house in Kensington, the O'Brien name still carried the weight of an unwritten law. Family portraits hung like verdicts, men in dark suits, women with eyes trained in discretion. Each one had studied law at Oxford, each generation had inherited O'Brien and Sons, one of London's oldest and most respected firms. The house wasn't merely a home, it was an extension of the family's reputation. Sophie had grown up surrounded by phrases like O'Briens don't make mistakes or tradition is the pillar of authority. From an early age, she understood that her last name was an invisible uniform. At breakfast, her father, Rhys O'Brien, spoke more about penal codes than feelings. Her mother, Michelle, maintained an elegant silence, the kind taught at boarding schools where one learns to hold a glass and a lie at the same time. Sophie didn't hate her parents. She studied them. Like a lawyer examining a case before passing judgment. Sometimes, from the second-floor window, she watched them leave at 7 sharp for the family firm. She would stare at the reflection of their black car on the wet pavement and think that an O'Brien's life never really belonged to the person living it. At school, Sophie stood out not only for her intelligence but for her habit of questioning everything. While others memorized answers, she asked questions that made teachers uncomfortable. In her final year at the University of London, she announced she wouldn't continue the legal tradition. Instead, she wanted to work on a tech project focused on financial intelligence. Her father looked at her the way a judge looks at a witness who has just lied. "It's not about money, Sophie," Rhys said that night at dinner, his voice calm and cold. "It's about the name." "Exactly," she replied. "I want my name to mean something more than a plaque on a door." The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. The next morning, Michelle left a letter on her bedside table, a veiled invitation to reconsider the impulsive decision. Sophie kept it unopened. She never answered. O'Brien and Sons dominated a greystone building in Lincoln's Inn Fields, the legal heart of London. There, between Corinthian columns and file cabinets the size of coffins, strategies were forged that shaped courtrooms, parliaments, and political donations. The air smelled of paper, whiskey, and pretension. For a while, Sophie interned there. She was 22, with a disquieting talent for spotting flaws in contracts. Senior partners praised her, though Rhys avoided doing so in public. He feared that any sign of pride might look like weakness. One day, during a meeting on corporate mergers, Sophie interrupted a powerful client to point out a hidden clause. The man looked at her with a mix of disdain and surprise. Rhys reprimanded her afterward, behind closed doors. "In this firm, we don't interrupt, we imply. We don't correct, we suggest." That sentence marked the beginning of the end. From then on, Sophie stayed quiet in meetings, but never in her mind. In the evenings, she walked along the South Bank, watching the glass towers catch the sunset over the Thames. She loved that kind of architecture, bold, unapologetic, needing no permission to exist. One night, in a cafe in Shoreditch, she met an engineer named Lara, a cybersecurity specialist. They talked for hours about algorithms, cryptocurrency, and how trust, the sacred word of the law, was beginning to migrate into code. From that conversation, the idea for her startup was born, TrustLink, a platform combining financial risk analysis and AI-driven contract traceability. It was the antithesis of the O'Brien world, transparent, disruptive, free of rigid hierarchies. When Sophie finally announced her resignation from the firm, the silence at home was more devastating than any argument. Rhys didn't speak to her for months. Michelle pretended everything was normal, inviting her to dinners that Sophie declined with work excuses. Only her brother Charlie, the eldest, the heir apparent to the legal throne, stayed close. Charlie was kind, brilliant, and most of all, trapped. He had learned to survive within the family structure with the docility of someone afraid to break something fragile. "Don't judge them too harshly," he told her one evening as they walked through Covent Garden. "It's the only language they know." "And if that language is rotten," Sophie replied, "someone has to stop speaking it." In those years, London became the stage for exile and reinvention. Sophie rented a small flat in Clerkenwell, exposed brick walls, a window overlooking a narrow alley that always smelled of coffee and damp air. From there, she began to build TrustLink. The first months were sleepless, failed pitches, endless coffees, and quiet moments of doubt. But there was also a freedom she had never known before. The money didn't come right away, but clarity did. Sophie realized her true gift wasn't in following rules. It was in writing them. Within 3 years, TrustLink had grown from an experimental project into a company valued at $100 million. Financial newspapers began to feature her as the face of the new London entrepreneurial spirit. The press gave her a nickname that made her smile: the Heretic O'Brien. One autumn morning, as Sophie watched the slow traffic crawl through Holborn from her window, an unexpected email appeared in her inbox, a formal invitation to dinner at the family home. The tone was impeccably polite, but the message was unmistakable: "We'd like to discuss possible synergies between O'Brien and Sons and TrustLink." She read the line several times. Synergies. It was her father's favorite word when he wanted to disguise control as cooperation. That evening, Sophie returned to the Kensington house for the first time in 4 years. The iron gate still creaked the same way. The hallway clock still marked the same 9:15 as the day she'd left. In the dining room, Reese and Michelle were waiting for her with carefully practiced smiles. Charlie was there, too thinner now, with a trace of weariness in his eyes. "It's good to see you," said Michelle, pouring her a glass of wine. "Thank you for the invitation," Sophie replied, making no effort to fake emotion. The conversation circled around pleasantries and accomplishments until Reese got to the point. "Your company has enormous potential," he began. "But it needs a firmer framework. Under the family firm's umbrella, we could offer you guidance, structure, reputation." In that moment, Sophie understood they hadn't invited her out of affection, but out of need. The old house smelled just the same as always, of polished wood and calculation. When Reese uttered the word merger, the air itself seemed to tighten. Sophie didn't raise her voice or change her expression. She simply folded her hands on the table and looked at him with a calmness he might once have found intimidating. "What you call a merger, Dad," she said, "sounds a lot like an acquisition." Reese tried to soften it. He spoke of legacy, family, shared values. Sophie listened to every word, the way one reads a contract line by line. She knew that behind every gentle phrase lurked the old desire to domesticate her success. Charlie avoided her gaze. Michelle kept her neutral smile, the kind used by those who fear a single crack might ruin the porcelain. When dinner ended, Sophie was the first to stand. "Thank you for the offer," she said. "I'll think about it." But she already knew her answer. That night, she walked alone through the damp streets of Kensington, without an umbrella. The lights of passing taxis reflected her face in puddles, doubling her image like an accidental metaphor. She didn't feel sad. Only clear. She understood that the O'Brien family would always see her as an anomaly, a glitch in the genetic code. But she also realized that, unlike them, she had learned to rewrite her own language. In the reflection of a closed bookshop window, she caught her own gaze and thought, "I didn't inherit the name. I dismantled it." And for the first time in years, she truly smiled. Winter in London doesn't shout, it pushes with an open hand. At 7 in the morning, the windows of the Clerkenwell building were beaded with water, and the street below looked freshly washed by someone impatient. On the 3rd floor, a faint neon sign whispered the company's name, TrustLink. Inside, the lights had been on long before dawn. Sophie stood before a wall of metrics, holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The city wasn't kind to those who moved fast, which was exactly why she preferred to move quietly. The team had grown beyond what her old notebooks could have imagined. 18 people in total, scattered like islands across the open floor. A designer with green hair, headphones the size of planets, a Senegalese analyst who solved problems as if disassembling watches, 2 programmers who shared a mint plant and a secret, and Lara, the cybersecurity engineer, walking with her short, assured stride, as if the floor itself were a password only she knew. The scent of fresh coffee mingled with the soft hum of machines. Outside, the world was gray. Inside, the air carried the color of focus. Sophie liked to observe before speaking. It was an old habit. In her Kensington home, the sound of cutlery had been enough to tell her whether her father was in good humor or if dinner would turn into a trial. She'd learned to read without asking. Now, that instinct told her the perfect moment to gather everyone around a screen. We need to be less pretty and more useful, she said evenly. The traceability module works, but the interface still talks like a sleepy lawyer. Small, restrained laughter followed. Lara nodded, eyes fixed on the code before her. We also need to finish linking the sandbox integration, Lara added. The algorithm needs live data. Otherwise, it's just predicting from a museum. Sophie made a mental note of that line. In her old life, decisions were made in rooms lined with polished wood and framed authority. In this new one, they were made in sentences like that, quiet ones that open doors. It was a sober kind of learning, authority without ancestry. By mid-morning, they took a break. The sky had lightened just enough for the city to pretend to be kind. Sophie put on her trench coat and walked to Leather Lane. Food stalls steamed, and office workers ate standing up, holding bowls as if they were compasses. She loved that timed chaos. She bought soup, looked around, and thought that freedom had its own aesthetic: shared tables, tangled cables, backpacks, and quick glances. No silver trays. No portraits watching. That was enough. Growth, she knew, had been a sum of choices that earned no applause. She'd refused early capital when she couldn't yet tell who would hold the leash. She hadn't hired friends out of loyalty. She'd chased no headlines. After 3 years, the platform was already working with mid-sized banks that preferred transparency over noble shields. The algorithm learned from real contracts, detected cascading risks, and translated everything into plain language as if complexity were a dialect that deserved subtitles. It was, in a way, what Sophie had never seen in her home: clarity without suspicion. Fame came later, the way birds arrive where there's bread. A tech magazine named her among 30 under 35 shaping the future. She clipped the page and hid it in a drawer no one opened. In Rhys O'Brien's office, however, lists began to form: names, alliances, advantages. The O'Brien name had always survived by reading the terrain. And the terrain now tilted toward the glow of a screen. The first sign that the family hadn't let her go was elegant enough to pass for affection: an invitation to a panel at Lincoln's entitled Ethics in Technology and Law. O'Brien and Sons appeared as co-organizers. They had chosen their words carefully: ethics, technology, applied, law. The message was the same as always: we want you to speak, but on our carpet. Sophie attended. She sat at the far end of the table, away from the over-polished microphones. The high ceilings mixed echo with authority. Rhys didn't approach her, he simply watched, the way one watches a ship that refused to dock where it was assigned. At the end, a senior partner leaned in and told her the firm was proud of her brilliance. She smiled without showing teeth and left before the wine was poured. The second sign was trickier. A venture fund with a double-barreled name, Whitcomb and Harrow, requested a meeting. They said they were interested in leading the next round. They offered not just capital but doors. Sophie noticed how quickly they grasped the technical details. Later she learned that the brother of one of their junior partners had interned at O'Brien and Sons. London, she thought, is a village if you look at people's calendars. The meeting took place in a glass room overlooking the Thames, near Blackfriars. The afternoon was pale, the ships on the river moving as if in slow motion. Whitcomb spoke of horizons. Harrow spoke of legacy. Sophie didn't take notes. She counted breaths, pauses, the careful way they used her name. They offered money, yes, but also a board seat for someone experienced in reputational compliance. Someone who, by pure coincidence, had once been a partner at O'Brien and Sons. "You're not helping me if you're just sending me back to the cage," Sophie said gently, as one declines dessert. Silence lingered a few seconds longer than usual. Whitcomb smiled without showing the back of his throat. Harrow changed the subject. That night, back in Clerkenwell, Sophie stayed alone in the office for a while. The city, seen through the glass, was a map of lights making no promises. The feeling was strange, a mix of exhaustion and certainty. There was something almost physical in the act of refusal, a piece with sharp edges. She checked the org chart, confirmed the legal protections, reread the bylaws she had drafted herself with a lawyer who owed favors to no one. No one would slip in through the shortcut of a name. Even so, the third sign came all the same. One Sunday, in the opinion section of a conservative newspaper, an article appeared about London's new rootless technocracy. It didn't name her, but it described her, a founder with a history of family rebellion, a young company inflated by market enthusiasm, a technology that claims to replace the wisdom of institutions. It was a portrait without a face, a warning delivered in silk gloves. Sophie read the article standing in her kitchen, a cup of tea in her hands. She didn't feel anger. She recognized the scent of something old and familiar, the smell of being defined to be contained. She turned off her phone and opened the window. Cold air entered like a clean hand. She thought of Michelle, her mother, and how she had mastered the art of never saying no, only maybe later. She thought of Reese, who always chose the right verb and never explained whom he spoke with outside the house. And of Charlie, who sometimes sent her short messages always on signal, like someone leaving water under a locked door. "Are you okay?" he'd written the last time. "More than before," she'd answered. TrustLink's growth continued steady, unromantic, like the stride of someone who never looks back. They moved part of the team to a larger space near Old Street Roundabout, where glass buildings insisted on looking young. Sophie reduced her own presence in the press and amplified her CTOs. She didn't want the brand to wear her face. She had learned that from her family: when power rests in one figure, it can be undone by a headline. Better to be structure than spectacle. The new office smelled of fresh paint, the cables hidden neatly within walls no one would ever see. Lara installed a dashboard of alerts, tiny red dots lighting up whenever a contract showed signs of risk. Sophie liked staying late, alone with that glowing wall, as if staring at an inverted night sky. Each red light was a decision. Each decision, a straight line. Her days became a useful repetition of precise things: early walks along Regent's Canal, ducks cutting through the water like small arrows, meetings in cafes where baristas knew her name but never asked questions, nights of code to playlists that repeated just enough to disappear. Sometimes, when exhaustion settled on her like an extra layer of skin, Lara would appear with a dry joke or a quiet suggestion that never asked permission. Between them, there was a kind of closeness that didn't need decoration: long glances over screens, comfortable silences in elevators, hands brushing against cables and lingering a heartbeat longer than planned. They never crossed that line. Perhaps they didn't need to. Perhaps desire, too, knows how to read context and how to wait. The rumors spread quickly: TrustLink doesn't take money with surnames. In London, gossip turns into reputation faster than a sandwich disappears. But that didn't stop the family. They simply changed tactics. A charity gala, children's cancer research, placed them at the same table, in a chandeliered hall in Mayfair. Michelle, wearing a blue dress that softened her features, greeted Sophie with a warmth that felt almost new. Reese, on the other hand, chose nostalgia as his argument. "Do you remember how you used to love stamping papers with the firm's seal in the library?" he asked, as if the past were a form of legal reasoning. Sophie met his gaze. She remembered the chill of the ink more than the joy of the game. What Reese called nostalgia, she recognized as a draft for control. By the end of the dinner, he mentioned, without blinking, that they had reconsidered their proposal. It would no longer be a merger. It would be a strategic alliance with operational independence. "I don't need an umbrella," Sophie said simply. "It's not raining inside." In the taxi back, London stretched out like a calm serpent. The bridges were bones. The city seemed to know something she was only beginning to accept: you can lose a family without losing the name. And it hurts less when conviction hardens into muscle. Days later, another kind of pressure arrived, more technical this time. An external auditor, hired by one of the mid-sized banks they worked with, requested a full review of TrustLink's algorithm explainability module. Not abnormal, just inconvenient. Sophie recognized the surname, a consultant who had once worked for O'Brien & Sons on compliance projects. London was small again. She took a breath, opened the door wide, and let the cold air in. She didn't want anyone to say she'd hidden. During the audit, she answered every question with dry precision, no adornments. She showed documentation, logs, decision matrices. The consultant soon ran out of places to plant doubt without looking clumsy. When he finally left, he did so with a polite, brittle smile, porcelain courtesy. Sophie knew there would be another attempt, through another door. Persistence was the golden thread of her family's craft. Meanwhile, an invitation arrived from a prestigious university. They wanted to honor her for her contribution to contract traceability.
The ceremony would be held in a wood-floored hall in Bloomsbury.
She accepted for a reason she never said aloud. It was neutral ground, far from the firm, far from the neighborhood where obedience had been carved into her. During the ceremony, as she stepped down from the stage with the diploma in her hand, she saw Michelle in the second row, applauding softly. For the first time, her mother's face wasn't held up by invisible strings. She looked tired, human, guilty of a guilt she couldn't quite name. Afterward, she approached Sophie. "I'm proud of you," she said. The words sounded rehearsed, but also like something she had finally decided to believe. Sophie thanked her and didn't ask anything else. She had learned not to set traps for mirrors. That night, in her apartment, Sophie switched on the kitchen light and stood with her back against the wall for a moment. The award on the table had no weight. What did was something else, the certainty that soon she would have to say something aloud, in public. Not to defend herself, but to draw her own outline. The family had made offers, moved pieces, tightened invisible strings. It was time to mark clear lines on her side of the map. Meanwhile, the days kept their rhythm like a metronome: quick meetings, concrete tasks, small decisions with consistent consequences. The team had grown used to her way of asking questions, stripped of ornament, surgically precise. It was her version of saying, "I respect you," without having to say it. One afternoon, Lara came into our office with a folder and a measured expression. "They're replicating us," she said. "A new startup in Canary Wharf. They're cloning part of our process. Nothing serious yet, just copying the obvious." Sophie studied the screenshots, unshaken. "The obvious is easy to steal," she said. "Let's make the difference invisible." They worked for 2 straight weeks as if sharing one breath, refining what can't be photographed: speed, clarity, a dashboard that didn't intimidate, language that didn't condescend. When the sprint ended, they turned the module on and let it run. The metrics board climbed like a tide rising when no one's looking. No one clapped. No one hugged. They just breathed a little easier. Outside, the city carried on: red buses, hurried footsteps, tourists fighting with inverted umbrellas. Inside, something had aligned. The family's maneuvers returned in another costume. A childhood friend of Charlie's, now a journalist, proposed a soft feature for a Sunday magazine: the daughter who defied her name. It wouldn't be hostile, he promised. It would humanize her. Sophie laughed, without cruelty, the dry humor of someone who finally understands the rules of the game. "I don't need to be humanized," she said. "I pay taxes." Still, she called Charlie. They met for a walk through St. James's Park. The squirrels imitated people approaching, retreating, with the same politeness. Charlie spoke slowly, like someone telling half the truth to keep the glass from cracking. "He won't stop," he said. "He doesn't know how to lose. Or how to let go. He thinks everything is malleable if you press in the right spot. Including me." Sophie didn't hug him, it wasn't her language. She touched his shoulder. A small, almost administrative gesture, but sincere. "You don't have to take sides to love me," she said. "But you don't have to be his translator either." They walked on in silence. The lake looked like a mirror without will. Sophie thought, for a moment, that maybe family love was exactly that: reflections where you choose what to see and what to ignore. It was an ugly, useful thought, like truth when it arrives late. At the next team meeting, she announced internal reforms: an advisory board of people who owed no one favors, an added legal shield against hostile takeovers disguised as alliances, and a public communications protocol in case media pressure escalated. No one mentioned the family. They didn't need to. On the wall, the red dots of the alert panel pulsed in quiet sync. That night, she walked alone from Old Street to the Barbican Library. She liked that unapologetic brutalism: concrete, sharp lines, still water. Sitting on a bench, she watched the pond's surface. Some windows in the complex glowed, like frozen screens. The city made its own low sound, a mix of engines and rain, always at a distance. Sophie remembered the first time she had entered a boardroom at O'Brien & Sons. She was 20, wearing a borrowed suit and a pencil too new to write with. Now she wore a weathered trench coat, held a phone half out of battery, and carried a plan that didn't need to shout. It wasn't courage, it was order. Back home, She opened again the draft she'd been writing on impulse weeks earlier. It had no title, no clear addressee. A letter that, if it ever saw the light, wouldn't be an outburst, it would be a map. A listing of facts. A statement of limits. No insults, no pleas, no trauma served as spectacle. Just one line that held everything: you cannot call it family if it demands genuflection as proof of love. She left it on her desk beside a glass of water she didn't plan to drink. Sometimes dignity needs to cool down too. The following days were surgical. She rejected 3 meetings with funds of dubious background. Accepted one with a firm that had backed teams she admired precisely for what they didn't boast about. Signed 2 deals with regional banks that asked only for transparency, not a seat at her table. Adjusted salaries. Promoted someone who would never know why. That Saturday, she went to an exhibit at the Tate Modern and lingered before a single piece, a thick black line across a white wall. She thought of her life and her company as that line: nothing spectacular, everything clear. Meanwhile, the O'Brien name began to show fatigue in its strategy. If they couldn't enter through the front door, they would enter through morality. A Legal World newsletter praised the firm's quiet philanthropy under the banner of social responsibility. In the same issue, a column questioned the tech trend of replacing professional judgment with algorithms. It was a dance with 2 songs. Sophie smiled, neither in joy nor in irony, but with the calm recognition of someone who already knows the whole repertoire. Then, early on a Thursday morning, a message arrived from Charlie. Short. They're going to pressure you again with the audit thing. They'll say if you don't agree to an independent external review, the banks will withdraw. Dad thinks you won't stand the media noise. Sophie set the phone on the table. Looked at the wall of red lights. One was blinking. She turned it off, as if in a quiet ritual. Sometimes, calm is a form of resistance. She decided to move forward with something she'd been putting off: a voluntary audit by a European firm with no ties to London. It wasn't an act of defense, it was a way to close shortcuts in other people's narratives. If her work was going to be examined, it would be by those with no reason to please anyone in her city. Weeks later, the report confirmed what she already knew: the system was solid, the language clear, the risks visible and manageable. There was no heroism in that. Only craftsmanship. On a Friday evening, as the office emptied and the computers began to look like sleeping animals, Laura approached with 2 glasses of water and a half-smile. "Do you want me to talk to the infrastructure team about the migration?" she asked. "Yes," Sophie said. "And, thank you for staying late again." Laura shrugged, as if the question had missed its target. "No one stays here for you," she said. "We all stay for what we're building." Sophie nodded. It wasn't false modesty she heard, it was belonging. The kind of belonging that doesn't carry a surname. She walked home along Farringdon Road. The asphalt gleamed like something newly made. The buses left streaks of light like overexposed photographs. She passed a laundromat that smelled of soap and steam, and thought about all the things that get washed just to be used again, the name, for example. Ambition. Love in the wrong language. She smiled, tired but upright. She wasn't alone. Maybe, for the first time, she wasn't even at war. She was under construction. The next day, she sat down to add a few more paragraphs to the letter. She adjusted phrases, stripped out adjectives, left gaps where the reader, if they wished, could place their own guilt. She didn't name names, didn't recount petty humiliations, didn't play the victim. She listed offers, dates, actors. Exposed the machinery of an emotional system disguised as support. She kept it all in the present tense, so no one could mistake it for a tantrum from the past. It was, above all, a mirror. When she finished, she saved the document under a name that hurt with its plainness: Andres. She shut down the computer, looked at the ceiling, and listened to the faint hum of a train in the distance. London, even in its quietest nights, has the courtesy to remind you that things keep moving. Sophie sank into the couch, arms behind her head, and realized she was ready for the next move. Not to win, just not to lose shape. The city was still there, old and new at once, like her. Between concrete and glass, between lukewarm tea and the panel's soft glow, between loyalty and farewell. The surname, that invisible uniform, no longer carried the same weight. She had discovered it wasn't about changing clothes, but changing skin. Before falling asleep, one last message arrived from Charlie.
Whatever happens, I won't answer for you. It's your voice. And it's good.
She replied with 2 words that seemed small, but held everything. I know. She fell asleep with the precise calm of someone who understands that the next move won't require noise, only aim.
Outside, a taxi passed, leaving a yellow reflection across the glass.
Inside, a letter slept in a file with a brief name in clean hands. Victory didn't exist yet, but it already had a shape.
And for Sophie, that was enough for now.
London's winter stretched on as though it had struck a secret pact with the fog. Days were the same color, and hours made the same sound, the low hiss of tires over wet asphalt. Each morning, Sophie followed her habitual route from her flat in Clerkenwell to the TrustLink office, headphones in but no music playing. Silence had become her new way of listening. Those days, the letter still slept on her desk, unpublished. She reread it now and then, the way one tests the firmness of a bridge before crossing. It wasn't a threat, it was an exposition, surgical, unhurried. A dissection of control disguised as affection. Every word had been chosen as a tool, not a weapon. What was missing wasn't courage.
It was timing.
Meanwhile, the city spun on in its elegant indifference.
In the tube, people looked down.
In cafes, conversations were soft murmurs about markets and elections.
Sophie passed unnoticed, and she liked it.
Anonymity was a kind of rest her family had never known. One February morning, as she reviewed financial reports, her assistant interrupted with an envelope, no sender. Inside was a thick, cream-colored card stamped with the O'Brien & Sons seal in raised ink.
Summit on Corporate Integrity and Technology in Law. Rhys O'Brien was listed as host.
And, at the end of the speaker's lineup, her own name.
Sophie read it twice. She hadn't been consulted or informed. Her attendance was confirmed.
It was a perfect move. If she showed up, it would be seen as reconciliation. If she refused, as disdain.
Either way, the name would be pulled back into orbit.
She called Charlie.
Do you know about this?
Yes, he said after a long pause.
Dad thinks a public gesture can close the circle. That everyone wins. Except me. He doesn't see it that way. He thinks the name needs one voice. Sophie didn't answer right away.
She looked out the window, a sky the color of lead mirrored in the glass towers of the financial district. Tell him I'll be there, she said at last.
Are you sure?
Yes.
But not the way he expects. The event was held at the Royal Courts of Justice, a building designed to intimidate even the innocent.
Cold light poured through stained glass, columns gleamed like carved frost, and every step echoed as though the floor remembered every fear ever felt in those halls. Sophie arrived alone, dressed in black, her hair pulled back in a low knot.
No jewelry. No entourage. Just a thin folder under her arm. Rhys greeted her in the entrance, surrounded by colleagues and photographers.
He offered his hand as though she were a stranger. She shook it with the courtesy of a contract stripped of emotion. I'm glad you're here, he said, his smile perfectly measured. I'm not, she replied, but thank you. Michelle stood a few steps behind him, wearing the face of someone who wants to move closer but fears breaking the fragile balance. Sophie greeted her with a small nod. From the back, Charlie gave her a glance that said what words couldn't, careful.
The auditorium was full lawyers, executives, journalists, students.
The moderator introduced the main session as a dialogue between generations on ethics and disruption. Rhys spoke first. His speech was immaculate responsibility, continuity, the duty of institutions in times of change. Every word designed to smooth conflict, every pause rehearsed to sound spontaneous. When he finished, the applause was long, polite, mechanical. Then the moderator invited Sophie to speak. She stepped onto the stage with the calm precision of someone switching off a light. Integrity, she began, is not inherited. It's built. And what's hardest to build isn't success, it's independence. The murmuring stopped. She spoke for 15 minutes, without notes. She attacked no one, named no one. Yet each sentence was a mirror, and the audience could see the truth if they chose to look. There are structures that mistake tradition for control, she said. And there are people who would rather break than become decoration in someone else's story. When she finished, the silence was heavier than any applause. Reese smiled with pain behind his teeth. Charlie lowered his gaze. Michelle didn't move. Sophie left the stage without looking back. Outside, the flashes followed her, but she didn't stop. She walked down Fleet Street with her hands in her coat pockets, while the dusk dissolved over the taxis. She knew the public gesture had opened a crack, but it was a necessary one. In the following weeks, reactions followed like choreography. Some media outlets praised her for her rhetorical courage. Others accused her of familial ingratitude. Reese, in a brief interview, said, "Family always seeks to build bridges even when others burn them." Sophie didn't respond. Silence, once again, was her strategy. But beneath it, something was taking shape. That same week, an email arrived from Charlie. "Dad's moving contacts in the regulatory board. They want to review your contracts with the mid-tier banks. He has no proof, but he's implying conflicts of interest. Be careful." Sophie exhaled slowly. There was no fear, only a piercing clarity. She knew that if she stayed quiet now, the story would be written without her. And she'd spent enough of her life inside other people's scripts. So she decided to publish the letter. Not on social media. Not in tabloids. But in the Financial Herald, a paper of cold reputation and rational readership. She sent it with a brief note. Open publication. Signed, Sophie O'Brien. The letter began without introduction. "My family believes that individual success can be managed as a family asset. They don't understand that I don't reject what they represent, but how they wield it. They tried to turn my work into a tool for moral correction, and I refused. I'm not trying to destroy their legacy. I'm protecting mine." There were no insults, only facts, dates, emails, meetings, veiled invitations. She laid out every attempted takeover disguised as a merger, every public manipulation dressed up as reconciliation. She cited clauses, names, sources. It ended with a line that sounded like a verdict. Freedom cannot be negotiated through conditional affection. When the letter was published, London seemed to pause for an instant. It was read in universities, in business forums, in cafes where young people talked about startups and ethics. Some applauded her. Others feared her. But what hurt most in the Kensington house was the silence that followed. No paper sought out Reese for comment. For the first time, the O'Brien name was no longer a reference of authority, but of inquiry. Charlie called her 2 days later. "I just read it," he said quietly. "It's devastating. But necessary. I didn't want to hurt them, Charlie. I just wanted out of the script." "You did. And not just for yourself." The silence that followed carried the sound of an impossible reconciliation. Sophie understood that her brother, though still inside, had already begun to break from within. At O'Brien and Sons, the letter was read as betrayal. The partners demanded explanations. Reese said nothing for hours. Michelle cried quietly, not over public humiliation, but over the truth she'd recognized between the lines. A week later, Sophie received a single handwritten letter. The signature was her father's. It read only, "When the name feels too heavy, remember, you carry it. It doesn't carry you." It was the first time Reese had admitted surrender, though cloaked as advice. The following days carried a strange stillness. At TrustLink, the atmosphere was one of relief. The press stopped circling. The banks reaffirmed their contracts. When Sophie arrived one morning, Lara left a coffee on her desk with a note. "Now we can go on." Sophie read it, allowed herself a small smile, and replied softly, "Yes. Now we can." That night, she walked again along the South Bank, the same place where, years ago, she had dreamed of escaping her surname. London was still gray, but it no longer weighed on her. The river lights looked sharper now. Perhaps because, at last, she no longer feared her own reflection. In London, scandals don't make noise, they spread in hushed tones, in the tempered cadence of tea poured at 5 o'clock. Sophie's letter wasn't an explosion, it was a vibration that sliced through the corridors of power with the precision of a scalpel. The Monday after its publication, the Financial Herald sold out its print edition for the first time in years. In digital forums, no one debated technology or family, they spoke of structure, ethics, moral ownership. Some called her a visionary, others, ungrateful. But no one could accuse her of exaggeration. Every line was backed by dates, records, and emails. It was truth stripped of drama. For the first time in 4 generations, the O'Briens made headlines not for a courtroom triumph, but for an emotional fracture. The name had passed from marble to screen and in the crossing, lost its shine. At the firm in Lincoln's Inn Fields, the atmosphere was part funeral, part shareholders' meeting. The partners spoke in whispers, as though truth itself might be listening from the walls. Reese stayed in his office, staring out the window. He hadn't shouted or denied anything. He had simply aged in a week. Michelle entered without knocking. "There's no defense left," she said, laying a copy of the newspaper on his desk. Reese looked at her without speaking. "Maybe this isn't about defending anymore, Reese. Maybe it's about understanding what we did." "We did what we had to," he said, by reflex, by habit. "No," Michelle replied, her voice trembling slightly. "We did what we knew. And that's not always the same thing." Reese lowered his gaze. For a moment, he saw his daughter not as an adversary, but as a consequence. Charlie, meanwhile, didn't go to work that Monday. He walked aimlessly for hours around St. Paul's, unable to stop thinking about the nights when Sophie told him about her code ideas, and he pretended not to understand, afraid to admire her too much. The letter had stripped him bare. Not because it attacked their father, but because it said everything he had never dared to name. That night, he sent her a message. "If I ever doubted you, it was because I was afraid of becoming like Dad. But now I see, the difference lies in who has the courage to break." Sophie read it at dawn. She didn't reply in words. She sent him a photo of the South Bank at sunrise, the Thames still, the sky steel gray. It was her way of saying, "I'm at peace." At TrustLink, the impact was different. The staff looked at one another with a new kind of respect, tempered by awe. Sophie had done what most people only dream of. She had stood against the structure without losing composure. Lara was the first to break the silence. "I read it all," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "There's not a single line that isn't exact." "It wasn't revenge," Sophie answered without lifting her eyes from the monitor. "It was cleaning." "Yes," Lara said. "But even cleanings leave scars." Sophie looked up. "Scars aren't for hiding. They're for remembering which part survived." Lara smiled. "Then you survived beautifully." In the weeks that followed, the letter kept orbiting the public debate. Universities quoted it in lectures on corporate ethics. In Soho cafes, young people shared it like a manifesto. Some analysts called it a new feminism of economic independence. To Sophie, those labels meant nothing. She hadn't wanted to represent anything, only to exist outside the frame that had shaped her. Still, fame caught up. One morning, as she arrived at the office, a journalist was waiting by the curb. "Miss O'Brien, could we get an exclusive? We want your personal side." "You already have it," she said, not stopping. "It's published." From then on, she gave no more interviews, not out of fear, but respect for coherence. She had said what was needed. To repeat it would be to dilute it. That Saturday, Sophie traveled alone to Oxford for the first time since university. She walked the damp streets between buildings that smelled of stone and time. In an old bookshop, where the dust carried the dignity of things that don't need to move to exist, she bought a black notebook. On the first page, she wrote a single line. "Independence is a language learned in silence." She closed it and put it away, with no intention of filling it. She didn't need more words. Days later, Michelle called. It was the first time in years. Her mother's voice sounded tired, less composed. "I've read your letter many times," she said. "And every line hurt. Not because of what you said, but because you were right.
I didn't want to hurt you, Mom. I know.
But sometimes the truth doesn't wait for permission.
A long pause followed. The silence wasn't awkward, it was human. Did Dad read it? Sophie asked. He did. He doesn't speak of it.
But since then, he hasn't used your name in the past tense. Sophie closed her eyes. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was recognition. And in the O'Brien family, that was the closest thing to redemption.
That night, Sophie climbed to the rooftop of her building.
The air was cold, and London stretched below her like a model of flickering lights. From there, she could see the curve of the Thames and the towers of the financial district, glass and stone, past and future, coexisting without touching. She thought of her father, her mother, Charlie. Of the house in Kensington, where the clocks never ran late. Of the girl who had learned to stay quiet so as not to break the porcelain. And of the woman who, with a single piece of writing, had shattered the glass. She didn't feel proud. She felt light. The next day, an unexpected email made her smile, an invitation from the Museum of Science and Technology to speak about the ethical impact of automation. They weren't calling her for her surname, but for her work. It was the first time anyone had done so without attaching a family photo. She accepted. That afternoon, as she prepared her talk, she wrote one final line she never read aloud.
I wasn't born to rebel. I was born not to pretend.
In the Kensington house, life went on with the stillness of an inhabited museum.
Reese kept going to the firm, but without conviction.
Michelle attended charity events, her old smile missing its choreography. Charlie, quietly, began to plan his exit. He'd applied for a master's program in Berlin. One night, as Reese was filing documents, he found the letter he had written to his daughter, the short one, the one ending with the phrase about the weight of a name. He read it again, then locked it in a drawer. For the first time, he understood something his daughter had learned long before: the surname was only a master key. What it opened or closed depended entirely on who held it. Meanwhile, Sophie allowed herself something new: rest.
She had spent years measuring every movement, anticipating every reaction.
Now, for the first time, silence wasn't strategy, it was home. On Sundays, she wandered through the markets at Spitalfields.
Sometimes she bought flowers, sometimes nothing.
No one recognized her. And that, to her, was victory.
London hadn't changed much. But Sophie no longer needed it to.
She had learned to move through contrasts: old cafes and glass offices, wet taxis and dripping roofs, family memories and a present with no name. She knew the family story would go on without her, but her letter would remain, drifting like an open window in a house that had always lacked air. One afternoon, she received another message from Charlie.
I'm leaving for Berlin. I haven't told them yet. But I wanted you to know first. She replied, You don't owe them an explanation. Only a goodbye. And you?
Have you said yours?
Long ago. They just don't know it yet. Charlie sent a clover emoji. Sophie looked at it with tenderness.
In their family, affection had always spoken in symbols.
That night, she walked home in the rain.
The city smelled of bread and gasoline. She opened her living room window and listened to the distant trains. It felt strange to be free and at peace at the same time. Independence hadn't brought loneliness, it had brought perspective. The letter no longer belonged to her. It was part of London's air now, of quiet conversations, of young women quoting her without knowing her name. Sophie understood that, in a way, she had closed a circle that had begun long before she was born.
In the O'Brien family, women had always learned to stay silent.
She, instead, had learned to write. And in her world, writing was a form of justice.
Spring in London isn't a season, it's a truce.
The sun comes and goes with the same discretion as someone opening a door with no intention of entering. In Clerkenwell, flowers push through cracks in the pavement, as though the concrete has finally grown tired of pretending to be strong. Sophie watched that scene from the window of her new office. TrustLink had moved again, now occupying 2 glass floors in Old Street, where the skyline mingled with wires, antennas, and reflections. It wasn't luxury that made her proud, but the clarity of the air. There were no portraits of ancestors here, no motivational quotes, no clocks set to someone else's time. The metrics board still glowed, but it no longer obsessed her. The business was stable, the structure solid, the contracts renewed without conditions. The O'Brien name no longer appeared in any report, and that, she thought, was the truest sign of success. That morning, as she prepared a presentation for an international conference on technological transparency, a message arrived from Charlie in Berlin. "I read in the papers that you'll be speaking in Geneva. Dad read it too. He said he always knew you'd be brilliant." He said it without sarcasm. That's all. Sophie set her phone down on the desk. She didn't smile. She didn't feel anger either. She had learned not to read words as weapons or as offerings. Her father wasn't asking for forgiveness. But for the first time, he was acknowledging her without trying to domesticate her. And in that absence of control, there was something that resembled respect. She replied with one sentence. "I just hope he learns to be free, too." At night, Sophie stayed late in the office, not for work, but for quiet. She lit a single lamp, sat by the window, and watched the city as if studying a living organism. From there, she could see red buses sliding like arteries, the glass towers of Canary Wharf pulsing with light, and the river in the distance, slow, constant, like a memory that never stops moving. Lara sometimes found her like that. "Are you thinking or just looking?" she asked one evening. "I think when I look," Sophie said, eyes still fixed on the skyline. "About what?" "How power moves. It doesn't disappear, it just changes shape." Lara leaned against the glass. "And you? Did you change shape?" Sophie hesitated. "I think I finally found mine." Weeks later, she flew to Geneva. The conference gathered entrepreneurs, academics, journalists. Screens flashed graphs, data, algorithms, big words trying to tame ideas too wide for them. Sophie spoke last. She didn't read. She had no notes. She simply breathed, looked at the audience, and began. "For a long time, I was taught that reputation is inherited, that authority comes with a name. But I learned that true reputation is what remains when the name becomes noise." The room stilled. She continued. "Transparency isn't a technological value, it's a human act. It's about deciding what we let be seen, and what we still choose to hide. And above all, remembering that every structure, no matter how solid, collapses when it's built on fear." Her voice didn't waver. When she finished, the entire hall rose to its feet. It wasn't euphoria, it was respect. And respect, for Sophie, was the purest form of victory. That night, she walked alone along the shore of Lake Geneva. The wind was cold but not cruel. The water mirrored the city's lights as if the earth itself wanted to remember that it, too, could shine. She thought of her mother, of Michelle's quiet effort to hold together a house that was collapsing beneath its own perfection. Of her father, obstinate as ever. And of Charlie, walking now through a city where no one measured him by his name. For a moment, she imagined the three of them beside her, not as a broken family, but as free individuals, each paying the price of their own independence. She sighed, and the air that left her lungs carried more than fatigue, it carried release. When she returned to London, a letter waited in her mailbox. Not from the firm, from Michelle. The envelope was plain, unmarked. Inside, a note in her mother's handwriting. "Sometimes parents teach without meaning to. I taught you silence. You taught me to speak. Thank you for breaking us." Sophie read it 3 times. She placed it in a drawer beside her first university notebook. She didn't cry. But she sat still for a long while, sensing that this letter had closed something she hadn't realized was still open. Summer arrived without ceremony. At TrustLink, everything ran smoothly. The team was growing steadily. Lara smiled more often. And Sophie, for the first time, started leaving early. She walked along Regent's Canal, bought bread from a small bakery, and ate dinner by the window. Sometimes, passing the old buildings downtown, she felt a faint pang, not guilt, but nostalgia for something that had never fully been hers. She had discovered that freedom doesn't feel like an open door, but like a long breath. One evening, as she closed her laptop, she looked out the window and knew she would never again be the rebellious O'Brien, or the dissenting daughter. Just Sophie. No surnames. No manifestos. That night, she wrote one last entry in the black notebook she'd bought in Oxford. The family story was written in laws. Mine, in boundaries. I didn't inherit power. I redefined it. She closed the notebook and stepped outside. The sky was almost clear, rare for London. In the reflections of shop windows, she saw her silhouette cut by the light of the street lamps. She no longer looked like the woman who fled a house, or the one who built an empire. She was simply someone who had learned how to be alone without being lost. As she passed a bank branch, a group of young people stood outside talking about cryptocurrency and new forms of trust. She smiled, thinking the future was in good hands. Hers, at last, were steady. In Kensington, the O'Brien house remained intact but different. The largest portrait from the firm, the one of Rhys O'Brien, patriarch of the last generation, no longer hung in the main hall. It had been moved to a side room. In its place now hung an abstract painting in shades of gold, interlacing lines that looked like cables or routes of light. Michelle had insisted on putting it there. "It's not a portrait," she told the decorator. "It's a sign." Gold, she said, had always been the color of closures that still let light in. Meanwhile, in Clerkenwell, Sophie sent her last email of the day. She closed her laptop, turned off the light, and stood before the window. The reflection of the Thames moved slowly beneath the night. The city lights stretched across the water like threads of gold. She thought that perhaps her life was exactly that, a current that had drifted from its riverbed, not to escape, but to find another sea. Rain began to fall softly, as if the city itself wanted to applaud without making a sound. Sophie leaned her forehead against the glass, closed her eyes, and breathed. There was no victory to celebrate, only a peace that asked for no permission. A quiet, steady voice rose within her, whispering the truth that had always been there. "I never wanted to beat them. I just wanted to be free." And London, from below, answered with silence. The kind of silence only left behind by battles well fought.